Hi, my name's Harriet McKnight and this is my book Rainbirds, which is coming out in September. So Rainbirds is set in the remote East Gippsland town of Boney Point and involves two separate narrative threads that become increasingly intertwined towards the book's end. The first thread involves Pina, who has lived in Boney Point with her husband Alan for 30 years when Alan is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. Their story charts the progression of his disease and Pina's readjustment to her role in the relationship. I think she's really searching for indicators of the old Alan. So when a flock of black cockatoos take up residence in the bush around their house, she becomes convinced that they're what's tying him to the present. The second narrative thread follows Ariana, who is a conservation biologist living temporarily in Boney Point to undertake a reintroduction program of a subspecies of black cockatoos. She has a great deal personally riding on the project and becomes increasingly unstable when they leave her designated nesting area and take up residence near Pina's house. I think for a long time I probably railed against the idea of writing a book that emulated sort of the great Australian novel with its focus on the bush and country communities, but I grew up in a tiny New South Wales town called Gundaroo, and then we moved to the New South Wales south coast to the fishing village of Bermagui. So I think at heart I'm probably a bit of a country girl and situate myself very much to the natural landscape. Also, a great disbelief of mine is that we are continuing to debate whether or not climate change is real and sitting on our hands whilst our scientific community are telling us that it's upon us. I guess when writers talk about having a big unanswered question, that's probably one of the questions in my life that I'd like to discover an answer to. Well, I think, my grandmother suffered from dementia for several years before she passed away, and in a lot of ways I was quite fortunate because I was living in a different city, so I was distanced from the worst of her disease, but I definitely saw how it affected my mother and the way she had to sort of renegotiate her relationship with her mother as my grandmother's disease progressed. In that case, I was quite adamant to try and get the experience correct, just to, I guess, honour the people who are sort of left to carry the load of caring for loved ones. In some ways I think that dementia is becoming an increasingly relatable presence in our lives. It's something like 1 in 10 Australians over the age of 65 have dementia, and that number's increasing as the years go on. So the chances of any of us being affected by it are quite high. So I hope that Alan and Pina's story goes a little way to kind of showing what that is like. Well, I guess writing about the landscape was something that was quite important to me. Like I said, I grew up in two very distinct Australian landscapes, and it is quite central to all the characters' lives in the book, and felt like an element that I wanted to get correct to represent the area that I was writing about. I've always sort of felt that rather than being one flat conglomerate of bushland, Australian landscapes differ vastly from region to region, and each has significance, cultural significance to the Indigenous people of each area, which is something that I wanted to acknowledge as well. I guess also I hoped to show that landscape is something that is dynamic and layered and able to be engaged with, and that it has histories and stories and sort of informs our world whether or not we live in an urban or a rural environment. Well, I got really lucky. The artist is a South Australian artist called Dana Kinter, and I've sort of admired her work from afar for a while now. You know, a lot of her work centres on native landscapes and in particular native Australian birds and a lot of black cockatoos, so I thought she was a really lovely fit for the story, and I'm really thrilled that she let us use one of her images.